The normal way I do my talks, it gets confusing sometimes. I tell why I want to do a history on him, and then as I start talking about his background, I'll branch off in a couple of things, and if it's too long or I'm rambling, just yell out. The reason why I did an article on Irving Familia, W7SSB, was when I was a kid. When I was in 1956, my father got me a crystal radio. He had been a radio man in World War II on B-24s. And then Christmas, I got a little kit where I could, it was a pegboard, and you put all the components on the pegboard, and you could do a one-tube receiver, or you could do a code oscillator and a bunch of other stuff. And then it graduated up to my paper route and cutting grass. I'd always ask the neighbors, do you have an old radio in the garage or in the attic or something like that? And I'd take my wagon, I'd end up having a console Philco, bring it at home, and all sorts of radios. And back then, AM was the big thing. And I used to come home from school and listen to 75 meters. And one of the big stations on there, he was only 40 miles away from me in Rhode Island, was W7SSB, Irving Familia. He had a Johnson 500, and he had a clock on top of his Johnson 500. And as he talked, you could hear the tick-tock, tick-tock. So no matter when you got on the band and you could tune around the band, as soon as you heard that tick-tock, you know it was Irving. He only worked 75-meter phone at that time. He lived down in Manaposset, Massachusetts, and I didn't even know this. That town, little town on the ocean, was the building capital for whaling ships. I never knew that. Well, anyways, Irving had a 175-foot lattice tower in his backyard, and he was known all over the East Coast on 75. Well, anyways, as soon as I got my license, I talked to him, and that paper you're passing around with W7SSB on it, I had one of his QSL cards. I talked to him several times, and his history. Go ahead.
You ask him what time it is.
No. But one of the things with Irving, to go into his history, is amazing. Some of the things he did, but because he didn't build anything like Armstrong and DeForest and Tesla and Marconi, he's almost forgotten. And he was born in 1890 in by Mount Vernon, New York. And as a kid growing up, he had an interest in reading stuff about Marconi. And one of the things that he did at 11 years old in 1901, he asked his father if he could go see Marconi up in Newfoundland. Marconi had built a station to work England. And his father got the minister in town there. There's two stories on this. One, that they took him up and he met Marconi up in Newfoundland. Well, going from Mount Vernon, New York to Newfoundland, 1901, that had to be a major trip. And the other story is that the minister wrote us a letter to Marconi and told him about the young Irving and that he wanted to get into radio. Either way, he ended up getting free components to build his first radio receiver from Marconi, 1901, 11 years old. And so we put a receiver together, and the problem was there was nobody else on the air. Okay? And so we couldn't tell if the receiver worked or not. Well, Marconi was going to do his broadcast over to England, and they had it in all the newspapers. And so Irving invited all the people in the neighborhood and all his relatives to his house to listen to it on his headset. So the time came, Marconi transmitted, he didn't hear anything because the antennas were all heading towards Europe, and he was running a couple of KW towards Europe and nothing in stateside. Well, the problem was Irving was so embarrassed, everybody made fun of him. And he said, listen, you can hear buzz, buzz, buzz. Well, come to find out, people were hitting the doorbell down the street, and he was hearing the buzzer that was radiating. And so that's how he knew his receiver worked, because he couldn't hear anything else. Well, in 1902, 1903, 1904, Irving got local kids that were interested in wireless communications, and they begged, borrowed, and stole phone company wire, and they wired it to their homes using the telephone poles. They went under bridges, they went through the woods. They ended up with almost 40 people on a party line sending Morse code. Well, the problem was nobody had the batteries powerful enough to power all this stuff together. So Irving's younger brother was very sick. They had a live-in nurse. Well, her boyfriend worked for the phone company. Well, he came in and gave him a sender. He gave him the big batteries. He gave him all sorts of stuff. So now everybody was hooked up on this whole network. Okay, here he is, 13, 14, 15 years old. He then, at 16 years old, wanted to be a wireless operator aboard a ship. So they took him on the ship Caracas. And he was a steamship, and it went all through South America. He worked on various steamships, even going up into the Arctic and meeting Eskimos. And here's a kid, 16 years old. Okay, from then on, when he got back after several years being in radio, he heard that in Brooklyn Navy Yard, they're going to start testing amateurs in 1912. He went down, and he was the first one to be tested. That's why he was known as amateur number one. And 1912 also, because of the Titanic, they wanted to get everybody was operating on all the same frequencies, 300 meters to 6,000 meters, okay? And you had the amateurs, you had the ships, you had the ground-based stations trying to do communications across the world. And so 1912, they broke it down where amateurs were regulated to 200 meters, which was basically 1,500 kcs on the AM dial. Well, they couldn't broadcast anywhere. So they went from like 12,000 hams down to like 2,000 hams. Everybody dropped out. Okay. 1913, 1914, 1915, tubes were discovered, Audiotron was discovered, a lot of advances. It came 1914, Hiram Percy Maximum wanted to set up a communications network for coast to coast. Back then, all you had is the Western Union, and you had the phone company. And he wanted to be able to relay messages. Well, at 200 meters and the equipment they had, the transmission would only go over about 30, 35 miles. So then they had another relay station. So they had hams signed up all over the country to network this thing together. 1915, along with a guy named Clarence Tuska. Tuska was a very young kid. He was in his teens. Maximum was in his 40s. And the kid started designing and building his own receivers when he was 12, 13, 14 years old and selling them. Percy Maximum bought one. Sent it back, says, I don't like the quality of it. The kid's mother said, go down and see that man and find out why. He went down and met Percy Maximum. They were all both in the Hartford area. And when he saw the kid and his enthusiasm, he helped him build a better radio, and they became good friends. So in 1915, the league was started, ARRL, with Maximum and Clarence Tuska. Tuska was just a kid, but he started QST magazine, and he had 50% of the rights to the magazine. And they never thought they could get advertising to pay for it. They started going after membership, joined the league. The first issue, believe it or not, was 100 pages. It was hard to believe. And the reason why I bring that up is that one of the first people to do an article in it was Irving Familia. He became the first New England manager for the ARRL and was there for many years. So we're getting into World War II time, and they shut down all the amateurs. Over 6,000 amateurs ended up in the military in communications of some way or another. They cut, as you know, during the war, they stopped amateur radio. After the war, 1919, the Navy wanted to take over all the communications in the country, not have amateur radio. And a congressman from Massachusetts named Green, he was very favorable of amateur radio, and he sent a letter to the Navy Department saying, you can't take over the communications, you've got to let amateur radio exist. And he put a bill, number 217, through Congress to enact the amateur radio bill. Well, the Navy never got back to him, the bill passed, and the rest is history. 1919, the bands opened up for us again. In the meantime, through the teens, 14, 15, 16, 17, Irving, when he got back from being on the ships as a radio guy, he got the job down in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, working at the Marconi station. And the Marconi station had 4 210-foot wooden towers. I can't even imagine building those damn things. And they were on the beach. And they had a conical antenna hanging from all 4 towers. And they had the building there, and here's what I get a kick out of. They were running 30 kilowatts of spot gap, 50 to 60 amps when they transmitted on those wires. Inside the transmitting building, they had a receive building that was insulated. The stools the operators operated on had rubber legs or bottoms and seat. They had a wall there, and the key came through the wall, and they called it a pump handle. And all that did was key a relay, because they could not key with that current coming through the wall into that handle. It would kill somebody if they ever touched it. And the relay would energize the spot gap transmitter. There was so much electricity coming off that thing, the antennas, that they had a delivery guy show up one day with steel pipe on the truck. He was insulated because of the 4 rubber tires. Well, he's underneath the antenna. He didn't know. He gets out of the truck, goes to grab the tires, and gets knocked on his butt. All the operators had to wear rubber boots when they operate anywhere around there. The equipment got so hot that for every hour, only 45 minutes they could transmit, they had to let it cool down for 15 minutes. Well, that ran for many years up there, and he was the station manager for that. Then the U.S. Navy took the station over. They destroyed it, tore it down completely, sold it all for scrap. The guy that tore everything down, they gave him all the wood. And the only thing that's left now is, and you can tell how the ocean has changed, 2 of the concrete platforms are underwater now, out in the ocean. 2 of them are buried in sand. You can still see it sometimes sticking out of the ground. They now have a museum up there. Well, he then went down and worked at the Chatham Cape Cod wireless station, and also he worked at the Marion Mass station, which was also on the water. And he worked for many years with the spot gap transmitters for West Electric. It ended up going over to RCA at one time. Not Western Electric, Western Wireless. And he also got the bug to get into broadcasting, broadcast radio. And in the meantime, there was a lady called Eunice Randall. And she, as a kid in Manaposset, Massachusetts, didn't play with dolls. She wanted to be in electronics, radio, wireless. And she was born in 1898, and she built her own spot gap transmitter. Well, one day, she's on the air, and Irving Familia comes back to her and says, "Son, your father didn't teach you how to send code right." She sent back to him, "I'm not a son, I'm a female." Well, they became really good friends. They met. Well, here's one of the things that's interesting. She was 6'4". Okay, and he acted as her mentor. He got her a job with a company called Amrad up in Boston, which was an electronics company. I keep saying electronics, you know what I mean, electrical company making components. And they also had an experimental radio station called 1XE. And she worked as a draftsman for the electronics company. She worked as a design engineer, and she also worked at the radio station as the first female announcer in the country. She went on to have her own radio shows, and one time a guest didn't show up to her radio show, and she sang for an hour on the radio. And she went on to be very, very well known in the broadcast industry. And in World War II, she taught military operators how to send code, learn code. She died in 1982, and her last call was W7SSB up in Maine. So this is some of the things I get off the main subject a little bit. It's just that all this history is related. Irving got a job offer with a company called, I think it's Kilbright in Slocum. They were a retail store like Macy's in New Bedford. And they wanted to have their own broadcast station. So they hired him to set up and run a broadcast station. One of the things the early broadcasters did was the hotels wanted their own broadcast station, and the retail stores like Macy's, people like that. The reason why the hotels, they had the auditoriums where they could bring in a live audience and have entertainment and broadcast that over the radio. And they had the big buildings where they could put the antennas up on the roof. And they had the money behind them also. So Irving Familia worked for that company for several years, and for some reason they went bankrupt. He bought all the radio equipment from the retail store and brought it home, and his wife says, "What the hell is that?" He took one of the rooms of the house, put all the broadcast company equipment in there, and started his own broadcast radio station in his home. And he was covering Cape Cod, all of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut area, and running programs. Had people coming in and out of the house singing on the radio and stuff like that. Finally, he got hired by a company, and the radio call letters were WDAU, if I remember it correctly. And he became chief engineer there. And then he got an opportunity to do another radio station, and he progressed from there. In the meantime, he had been the manager up at New England for the league. And then the turn of the century into the 1920s, 21s, 22, broadcasting took off like crazy. But one of the problems we had was that the amateurs had no defined bands then. We had the 200 meters, yeah.
Yes, they did.
Oh.
Good.
The radio conference in 1925 in Washington, D.C., they allotted the broadcast band, which we know now. They took 200 meters away from us. They gave us 160, 80, 40, and 20, and 5 meters. 5 meters they use from, it's 56 megs all the way up to 68 megs. We had 5 meters until 1946, when they gave it to the television industry and gave us 6 meters. And then we got 10 meters around the 1927. That's when the World Conference, all these countries got together and they gave us W and N and K, and everybody got their prefixes. And that changed radio completely. Licensing came out. We had the Federal Radio Company or something like an FRC before the FCC.
It was the Department of Commerce Bureau of Navigation.
Yeah, well, that was in the beginning. That was in the beginning.
Federal Radio Commission.
Yeah, Federal Radio Commission. In 1927, precursor to the FCC. And in that time, they had first class, second class, third class licensing. The 1933 was the first single sideband transmissions, believe it or not. 1928 was the first television broadcast, experimental. But Irving Familia, all through this, worked his way up with RCA. He ended up working for one of the electronics companies and broadcast companies all the way to 1955. In 1947, 1948, he and another individual, I don't know how many know this, are you familiar with the OOTC? Old Timers Club. Okay?
They're still around.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have a hell of a website.
OOTC.
Yeah.
Most of you should be.
Yeah. Well, at that time, 1947, 1948, he was made the first president. And the requirement was you had to be in radio for over 40 years. So that brought all these Spock guys in and all this. Now, if you want to have a lot of fun, go on OOTC.us. That's their site. And they've got, you can go right down the list of all the members. You click on the list of the first 5 members. It brings up their pictures, their biographies, and what they're known for. And almost every single one of them for the first 20 years of the membership, the guys were hams. They work in the two-way communications business, ship to shore, running radio station. It's just phenomenal. And it comes all the way up to the present day. Some of them have pictures, some of them don't, but it's fascinating reading all this history of the OOTC. And you can still join. And Irving died in 1964. And he committed suicide. And the reason is that his wife passed away a few years earlier and he was lonely as hell. But his contributions to the broadcast industry, to the early communications industry, to the ARRL, he wrote some of the first articles for QST magazine, is amazing. And he was one of the few guys, we call certain actors like Cher one word. Well, he was known as Familia. You didn't say Mr. Familia, you didn't say W1ZE, you just say Irving or Familia, and everybody knew who he was because he was the first license. Also, there's a debate. He was the first ham to transmit in 1901 in Marconi. But everybody's up in debate about that thing. A fascinating story. He was very well liked. If you want to read a good book, there's several books on him. If you got any questions, I know I got a ton more, but I know I'm stretching this thing as it is. Yeah.
Well, did he have any children?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
You can't find it in any books that I found about having any kids.
So no find a grave location or?
Oh yeah, they got it in the bed. Oh, here's what you'll like. When I was going through the history and getting the story together, I said, who the hell's got the call letters nowadays? So I looked it up, W1ZE, it's a ham up in Maine. I tracked down his phone number, called him up, and he's 78 years old, was a W6, and he worked for the Bath shipyards up there. What's interesting was his last name is Randall, the same as Eunice Randall, that first woman broadcaster. So I asked him, are you related? He says, no, but he says, I know her. I said, do you have anything from WZE history? So he emailed me out a whole bunch of stuff that I couldn't find and I didn't have. So it's just fascinating as all get out. And that's I have more fun doing this stuff than getting on the air. I've been on the air, over 62 years now. And this to me is a lot of fun, learning the history. Anybody got any questions?